I'm John Arthur Berg. I am a privacy champion in itslearning. Today, what we're going to talk about is GDPR and data protection of personal data in the context of what so many of you have been through for over the last 10 months, remote learning, blended learning, this situation we are now in, which although it's been going on for very long, it feels like it's a bit of a emergency or a exception to how we normally do our work. Of course, as you can probably see, I'm sitting in my living room, and that's where I've been most of the last year. And of course, what's happened over the last 10 months is that remote learning and blended learning and the use of technology in the classroom has gone from being something that has been good to have to become something that's been completely necessary to have. And that's impacted many school systems, some school systems more than others, depending on kind of the maturity of the technology. And for a while in the beginning, it almost felt like this crisis we were in were trumping data privacy and data protection. Everybody was flurrying around to procure the technology they needed. But the question is, does the crisis? My first question is really, does the crisis trump data privacy? And I've been thinking about it, and I think what I've come to is actually it's the opposite. While there is in times of crisis, we cannot relax our data privacy. And a very good example of this actually happened in Norway, where I'm sitting, with the Norwegian government being very, very quick out to release a contract tracing app to allow government to trace and follow up on containing the virus spreading around in the society. And it didn't take them long to release it, but it also didn't take the data protection authorities very long to close it down again. So that was a very clear signal that even in times of crisis, data privacy is important. And I would say in education, actually, it's getting more important. And I'll take a moment to explain why I say that, because when we talk about protection of data, personal data and data privacy, the starting point is always, what's the risk to the people's data we are processing? So let's say in a normal situation, if a teacher's account on itslearning, for instance, got hacked, what would the consequences be of that? Maybe they had to switch to using the textbooks, or they had to switch to going into some other classroom activities. But in this time where people were, particularly where everybody was sitting home, having your system compromised really affects the people whose data you're processing. So key takeaway through these last 10 months is that data privacy is more important during a crisis like COVID-19 has brought with it. And it's raising the bar for what's acceptable or what's appropriate security. Now, I know there's a lot of people listening, and there's probably more people that's going to watch this on video later, and you all have very different roles. And for some people, talking about data privacy feels very complicated. And my advice often, if we have a mixed audience here, we might have some teachers, we have some people maybe working every day with data protection, and we have some school owners maybe listening to this. And kind of a common way of understanding data protection is through the rights it gives, because as educators, you all understand that your students have certain education rights, and that's put into law. And the same goes for data protection. These are rights that are put into what's called GDPR, in the European level at least, and it's translated into some kind of local law and language. And GDPR really gives some rights to everybody who have the data processed. And if we think about that through the eyes of our students or through the rights of our students, we can more easily understand what is it we need to fulfill when we think about data privacy. So the next few minutes, I'll talk through some of the most important rights, I think, that your students have. And maybe that gives some food for thoughts on how do we implement and change, and how do we adapt in times of crisis like with this global pandemic. So the first right, which is kind of broad-reaching, but it's important, has to do with the processing of the data being lawful or legal. And that's a kind of a common misunderstanding when it comes to data protection, is that it kind of starts with what type of data can we process. But it doesn't really, the starting point for all data protection legislation has to do with the purpose of the processing. And for most of you, the purpose of processing has something to do with education. And it probably has a lawful reason. There can be different lawful reasons according to GDPR, but it might have something to do with education law. But what we need to make sure when we come into this pandemic is that with all this new technology being used and all the new systems being used, and we're really expanding the scope of how we're processing data, but trying to keep up education remotely or in some kind of mixed environment, we have to ask ourselves, how has this changed our purpose for processing data? Do we actually need to go back and define the role personal data plays in the purpose of dealing with processing of data? And then we need to ask ourselves, are we sure that through this pandemic we haven't introduced some kind of illegal processing? Are the data involved that could be illegal under GDPR? And a very good example of data that is actually not allowed, or normally not allowed to process in an education context, is, for instance, health data. So how we, and in the pandemic, that's quite a challenge, because your student might be sitting at home for weeks. They might be tempted to give you some information about their health. I'm not feeling well today. I've been to the doctor, or I've had a COVID test, or I'm COVID positive. And a lot of this is stuff that you're really not allowed to bring into a digital learning environment. So that's a very important thing to consider in terms of the ongoing situation. I think the other thing to consider is that in this there is this requirement to minimize the data we collect. So maybe we started using a lot of new systems, but are we making sure that those systems are only getting the minimum amount of personal data that we actually need to conduct our business? So we might have started using some new tools. That tool might have asked, as a standard field, what's the gender of the student, but do we really need that data? If not, we should make sure that it isn't actually processed. And then it's also about making sure that the documentation we have as an organization, or you as an organization, accurately kind of reflects the new normal. This is often referred to as Article 30 documentation, because it's quite clearly stated in Article 30 of the GDPR what it should be, because that goes a lot into details on what the processing involves, what types of data, what are your vendors, etc. And that documentation should really be up to date also through the pandemic. And then, not at least, if you're bringing in new vendors, you have to make sure that you have legally binding contracts, and we'll come back to that a little bit, but to make sure that those contracts are compliant with the regulatory environment. I'll give you a couple of examples where this has actually gone wrong during the pandemic. And this is an article from a Norwegian newspaper, and it's been Google translated, so it's not perfect, but there was actually a school in Norway that decided that since the kids, upper secondary kids, were staying at home, they would use a training app to track that they were actually doing their PE, their gymnastics. And for that, they received the fine. And I think in this is a good example, and this went wrong on many levels, really, because sort of requiring a student to download an app where they then have to give a consent doesn't really work. And I can imagine that there isn't really a legal kind of contract between the school and this app. But then again, this app collected a lot of data, like for instance, the positions where the students were running or walking or whatever they were doing, and also then implicitly where they were living. And this was data that really wasn't appropriate just to figure out if they've done their gym or gymnastics or PE. Another example is actually it's a personal example. It's from my daughter. I have an 8-year-old daughter, and one of the tools they're using a lot now for homework and for blended learning, and sometimes through the period where schools here in Norway were completely shut, she got asked to give a consent to having her data processed. Again, several things that went wrong here, of course, but an 8-year-old cannot consent to having their data processed, and there was lots of other issues with this too. So these things, people are being creative, and I can appreciate that, right? But again, we need to focus on data protection also in the times of a situation like this. The other thing to mention, I think, which is important, is that students have a right to be forgotten. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is data you don't need to fulfill your purpose as an education institution should be deleted when the purpose is sort of passed. Obviously, you have a need for certain documentation when it comes to grades and assessments for a long time, but there are other data that can be deleted quite quickly and should be deleted quite quickly. An example could be if the student leaves school, there is a lot of data that's been stored in various systems that should be forgotten about. And this is particularly important now that we have implemented maybe a lot of new technologies during the pandemic. Do we really have an overview of what type of student data is where in what systems? And have we thought about how all these different personal data will be deleted, and what the rules are for when the data will be deleted? So let's say if we were now using, we're using GoToWebinar right now, what would, if I use that in a classroom, if I store a video of the teaching and maybe there's some students talking in that, how long is it appropriate to store that data? So we need to make sure that what's often called retention policies are updated, and that the vendors we use actually are able to delete the data when it should be deleted. So this is, again, kind of a fundamental principle, so that make sure that the technology you're using now during COVID, or maybe you're going to use it afterwards too, supports you in actually letting the students be forgotten in places that we don't need their data anymore. Another important thing is the right to access data. This is a very, very universal right, and it's a big and important right for everybody who has their data processed by anybody, really. You should always be able to ask somebody who controls your data and processes your data if you could get access to the data that's actually being processed about you, if you could get a copy of it. And for that to even work, you need to make sure that the systems you're using, your own systems maybe, have good exports mechanisms, so you could actually get the data on that particular student and take it out in a format that's somehow readable. But equally, you need to make sure that the vendors you bring in during Corona, let's say if you're brought in a tool for maths, you know, and it's kind of a personalized tools. You can have your students do, you know, work from home with solving maths tasks, and then maybe that system stores some assessment on their progress. You know, this is data that they're actually allowed to ask for, to be able to see. And do the vendor we bring in really help you in gathering together that data if it's needed, if a student or indeed a parent, or guardian of the student ask for a copy of that data. That's often a difficult requirement to think over when you implement new systems in a hurry. Another important right that people have when they have their data processed is transparency. What we mean by transparency is really just that. It's just whatever reason you're processing my data, I should know. You know, it should be easily available to me why you process my data, what types of systems you use, what types of data you process, and I think, you know, many school owners already have this information available, but was that information updated during kind of all the changes that might have happened in the last 12 months? And is that information really easily accessible to students and parents? And of course, are we actually telling our students and the parents about these rights they have? These are important questions, I think, to ask if you're involved in implementing new systems or involved in kind of implementing new ways of working during the corona. Transparency is important in terms of data protection. Then we have the security itself. And GDPR doesn't really define what type of security systems need, to be honest. It's much more high level, if you like, for that. But what GDPR says is that we need to have appropriate security measures. And that means security measures that are appropriate to the type of processing we're doing. And security measures isn't only, you know, encryption or backups, those kind of things. It's also the organizational security. And, you know, have we trained teachers? Have we trained other staff? Have we raised awareness? Do we have policies in place that kind of defines the do's and the don'ts of using systems? And have we assessed if we brought in some new vendors, some new suppliers during the pandemic, did we really assess to see if their security measures were good enough? Are there some security measures we need to strengthen? Because as I mentioned earlier at the beginning, you know, when these systems we use for remote or blended learning becomes more critical, we also need to strengthen the securities. So we need to ask ourselves that, are there parts here we should reconfigure or do some changes to when it comes to security due to how critical this has become for us? Another thing is also very concretely on the authentication side, and I'll show you an example of that in a second. This is actually from the webpage of the Norwegian Data Protection Authorities, part of it, and the other part is from the International Conference of Data Protection and Privacy Commissioners. And this is a very, very clear advice, and it's advice I like to echo, that when you're using a learning platform, if you're using a school administration systems, it's not enough for teachers who can access the vast amount of data, a big number of students, to just use username and password. There needs to be strong authentication, or that means multi-factor authentication, you know, where you get a code on an app or on a text message. That's the kind of things that I think has been even more important during the pandemic, to protect these systems so they're not compromised when they're so critical as they are during the pandemic. And you know, the opposite example of that is what happened in it happened in many countries, right? When we went to these web conferencing tools, like for instance, the one we're using now, a lot of mistakes were made when it comes to authentication, because a lot of these rooms, online teaching rooms, were set up without authentication at all. So, if you had a link, or if you could kind of guess the link to a meeting room, anybody could join. So sometimes you had classes being taught online, and somebody who were not supposed to be in that class got into that class, and maybe had some inappropriate behavior or showed some inappropriate material, and of course also got access to seeing who often was in that classroom. So that's an example of not an appropriate security measure in terms of protecting personal data. Another point to remember too is that students and everybody else whose data is processed also has a right to be notified if there is a data breach. And I think the question to ask, particularly when we build up our digital ecosystems, is, are we sure that our vendors will actually notify us if they experience a data breach? And do we have ways of notifying our users if that's needed? There are requirements in GDPR on notifying users, teachers, parents, and also the authorities if the data breach is of a certain character or introduce a certain risk. And lastly, and this is also maybe the most difficult topic, is there is a right to have your data protection rights respected, even if data is processed outside the EU or EEA. And a lot of the tools that are used are often have data processed in the US or in other countries that are kind of not approved by this European model. And that actually, in those cases, we need to make sure there are valid transfer mechanisms to ensure legal compliance. And also, given kind of the recent ruling this summer, which kind of came on top of the pandemic in some ways, it's by the European Court of Justice. Some of these transfer mechanisms that kind of allows data to flow from Europe to the US, they were made invalid. And those who are not made invalid, something called standard contractual clauses, they have been tightened in even more. So that was a brief kind of presentation, I think, on how to think about GDPR. If we look at it from the rights that the students have, it might be easier for us to understand what do we need to focus on data protection, and how do we go about it, whether you're a teacher, whether you're an administrator, whether you're working with implementing technology. So I hope that's useful to you, but I wanted to close off with one thing, and that is, just remember, even if we say data protection is difficult and we need to consider that, we shouldn't make it an excuse to kind of close down the way we deal with remote schooling. We shouldn't say, okay, well, everybody's just going to have to stay off. We'll close the schools, we'll close the web cameras, and we're going to have to, because data protection and privacy is a fundamental human right, but so is education. So keeping being able to keep up education, learning, teaching during times like COVID is super important. So don't let data privacy issues stop you from doing that, but use it as a quality assurance process, and let it help you take the right decisions when you decide to implement new technology to support students that are sitting at home. Yes, that's it for me, but we will have a Q&A, so you can still write questions in the question section. And there is also a poll now, I believe that's coming up on your screen that you can answer. This is to help us understand what kind of topics we should have for our next webinars. And then I'm going to hand it over to Anu. Are you with me?
Yes, I'm here. I'm actually looking at the list to see if there are any questions. And so far, we haven't really received any questions. So I'm going to keep this poll going up. And if you have any questions at all, do use the question tab to actually send in your questions. We'll be here for another 5 minutes to answer any questions. And of course, you can always reach out to John, Arthur, and myself later if you have some questions or something you'd like to clarify about GDPR and data security in your schools. There is one question here, actually, we've got now, John. What about cloud services, AWS, Google, etc.?
So yeah, and I guess the context of that question might relate to some of the challenges with data transfer between Europe and US, and there is no simple answer to that. It depends a little bit what you're asking about. Like, for instance, if you're from itslearning's point of view, we don't strictly transfer data to the US. We have all our data in European data centers, but we still process it in the cloud. So of course, we need to make sure that whatever vendors we bring in are compliant with our security measures and the security measures we offer to our clients. And there is one thing that is a challenge at the moment for many vendors, and that is, what about cloud services that are in Europe but owned by American companies? Because different countries in Europe might have more focus on this than others, one of the steps we have taken to kind of, ourselves at least, to avoid those kind of problems is encryption. Making sure that data that we, for instance, put with US-based vendors is encrypted, so that even if they were told by the courts in the US that they need to hand over some data, there is no data for them to hand over because we kind of keep the keys. But there isn't really a right or a very straightforward answer to this, and I would encourage everybody to kind of seek guidance. For instance, in Norway, the Norwegian Data Protection Authorities has some really good guidance on use of, for instance, Google Classroom, which is a typical service that involves a lot of data transfers and stuff. And it's not so often about yes or no. It's more about how do you implement it, how do you set it up, how do you inform your users about it. So that's an important thing. I do have to say one thing though. There is a lot of trailblazing teachers that might want to find a tool online, a cloud service, and just want to use it because they see that it has a value for their students. This is very difficult to make compliant. I have to say that right away. And so I think in those cases, school owners should really have good organizations in place that can help to figure out which vendors can we use and which vendor shouldn't we be using. So I think we need to make sure we're not in a situation where it's a bit like it's up to each and every teacher where personal data is shared, because we can't require from our teachers to be GDPR experts enough to stay compliant.
We do have one other question, John, and it's actually about the itslearning platform, but we are also running tight on time. So I'm going to launch our last poll alongside while John answers this question. The question is it easy for a student to get an export of his or her data in the itslearning platform? How is this done?
Yes, so that's a good question. The answer is, I hope you can still hear me because something happened here, but it was just a poll that came up. So if a student wants access or an export indeed of their personal data, first and foremost, itslearning will never give it to them directly. And the reason for why we will never give it to them directly is because it's not us to give to them. It's really the school or what's called the data controller in GDPR who has kind of that responsibility to do. But what we have is features in itslearning that allows a school owner, or we can work with them, or the school owner can do it themselves, can take an expert of their data. But the reason for why we don't want to hand it over straight directly ourselves is because while there is this right for getting access to all your data, you also have to make sure you don't infringe on other rights in doing that. That could be the right of another individual. Let's say if a student has written an assignment and there is another student mentioned in that paper, maybe that needs to be taken out of the data set before it's handed over. Another reason for why it's like this is also that often these kind of requests comes from parents. And in those situations, the school owners, the data controllers really need to assess how to balance the privacy of the students versus the parents' right to access this data. So it's just the complexity means that there isn't like a big export button in itslearning for each individual user to export, but there is a mechanism so the school owners can do that themselves. Yes.
I think that's it. I don't see any more questions coming in. So thank you very much, John. This was a really illuminating and even for me a very informative session. I hope all of you, our attendees, found it as informative. And as we mentioned in the announcement of the webinar, we'll be sending you a recording of this webinar as well as the GDPR checklist for school owners that you can download and reach out to us if you have any more questions about GDPR and data security. Thank you very much for attending, and we'll have more webinars soon. See you then. Bye-bye.
Bye.